Hello and a very warm welcome to another edition of Talking Germany, the show where we do just that. Now, all eyes are currently on Germany as the country celebrates the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall that signalled the end of the communist regime in East Germany. Now, since 1990, there's been an agency that handles and provides access to all the files compiled by the former East German secret police, the notorious Stasi. It's widely known here in Germany as, quite simply, the Birthler Agency, after the woman who's run it for the past 9 years or so, Marianne Birthler, and she is our guest here in the studio. Frau Birthler, thank you very, very much for joining us today. My first question, you've spent 9 years dealing with Stasi Files, one person spying on another. Has that made you a happier person or a sadder person?
I did fear it would make me unhappy to read so many stories about disgrace and betrayal and the things that people do to each other. But as it turned out, these files also contain numerous contrasting stories about people who were courageous, who put up resistance, or who managed to remain decent people going on about their daily lives, which was not such an easy thing to do.
Okay, so good and bad stories. What has all this reading of the Stasi Files taught you about human nature?
That people are corruptible, and that whether or not they betray or remain loyal to others is all due to circumstance.
What have you learnt about yourself?
In hindsight, I've realized, well, I'm often asked if life in East Germany was dark and terrible, and I recall something quite different. And I was very content. I was active in the opposition movement, and I led an active life. I had good friends, we talked to each other openly and candidly. And for this reason, I think my life was better than that of the Stasi officers. I was admittedly spared from having to serve a prison sentence, and I didn't have to worry about my job, because I worked for the Protestant Church. So I was protected to a certain extent, and I can only speak for myself, and not for those whose lives were destroyed.
Okay, very interesting stuff. Let's find out a little bit more about Marianne Birthler's origins and how she came to be the head of the immensely important Birthler Agency.
For 9 years, Marianne Birthler, age 61, has been in charge of the records of the former East German State Security Service, known as the Stasi Archive. The relationship between Birthler and the Stasi goes back a long way. Like German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she grew up in communist East Germany. A native of Berlin, she played an active role in the opposition movement in the 1980s. She was born in 1948 into a social democratic working class family. Although she dropped out of the communist youth organization FDJ, the ruling SED party allowed her to graduate from high school in 1966. In university, she studied foreign commerce. Marianne Birthler was active in several East German opposition groups beginning in 1986, and Stasi agents followed her every move. She was involved in an initiative for peace and human rights, as well as a church solidarity group. Many protest rallies took place in the weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall. This one, on November 4th, 1989, on Berlin's Alexanderplatz, was pivotal. One of the speakers was Marianne Birthler, who was 41 at the time.
The hopes of hundreds of thousands are gathered on this square. Hope, fantasy, audacity and humor.
Demonstrations like these altered the relationship between citizens and the state, and led within a few days to the toppling of the wall. After German reunification, Birthler, the mother of 3 adult daughters, served in several functions for the Green Party. And in the first government of the new state of Brandenburg in 1990, she became Minister of Education, Youth and Sport. 2 years later, she caused a sensation when she resigned from the ministry in protest over unexplained Stasi contacts of the state premier of Brandenburg at the time, Manfred Stolper. From the mid-1990s, she worked mostly behind the scenes for the Green Party. And in October 2000, Birthler was elected by an overwhelming majority by the German Bundestag to head the Stasi Archive. And today, she's our guest on Talking Germany, Marianne Birthler.
Marianne Birthler, it was very interesting to see those shots there of the very, very young Marianne. Yeah? I'd like to ask you this question. When did you first realize as a young person that East Germany wasn't perhaps a country like any other?
I grew up with these ideas because I was lucky enough to be raised by a mother who let us know right from the start in what kind of political system we were living.
When did you start doing that? How old were you as a tiny 5-6-year-old youngster?
Maybe a bit older. But at the latest, when my sister and I came home from school one day and told my mother that we had learned about West Germany, what a terrible country it was with unemployment, homeless people and drug addicts, she looked at us and said, "Oh, children, you don't know what freedom is. You can't ban things like that." And she brought us up to value liberty and view East Germany through critical eyes.
And then you became involved in church groups that were actively working against the East German state. How easy or difficult was that?
It wasn't as though you had to fear for your life in the 1980s, but you had to expect drawbacks. Those with career ambitions had to forget them, and their children's education was also under threat. My children were not allowed to graduate from high school in East Germany, so you had to expect these drawbacks, as well as chicanery, sometimes even arrest, and being spied on. But in comparison to other dictatorships in which people feared for their lives, that was no longer the case for us in the 1980s.
And when you say that there were people actually sort of looking in on what you were doing, this was the Stasi. Could you see them? Were the Stasi working in the shadows, or were these people that you could point at people and say, he or she is from the Stasi?
Both. On the one hand, the Stasi also worked in secret and much more extensively than we realized. On the other hand, they sometimes acted out in the open, so we knew they were there. So we'd be afraid to speak openly and trustingly with each other. It was the state security's job to fight enemies, both real and alleged enemies. But it was also their job to teach people fear, to create a climate of mistrust and anxiety, and it managed to do both of these things with some success.
Okay, so the information that the Stasi collected was put together in the files, the notorious Stasi Files, and it said that if you took all the Stasi files in the possession of the Birthler agency that Marianne heads up, and you lined these files up next to each other, then they would stretch out over a distance of 20 kilometers. Let's have a closer look now at what the agency actually does with all this history.
January 15th, 1990. The people overcome the Stasi. Berlin citizens storm the East German Ministry for State Security. All that remains of the East German Secret Service is still accessible today at what's commonly known as the Stasi archives in Berlin. Shredded or archived, here are the secret files, the surveillance reports collected by the Stasi on many East Germans. And there is still great public interest in the contents of these files, with some 35,000 people visiting the archive every year.
I think these files should not be allowed to disappear, and they should always remain accessible.
More than 1.6 million people have so far applied to view the files. Journalists are able to research details of perpetrators, and victims can read their own files. This has led to the unmasking of many former Stasi informants, people who might otherwise have led unassuming lives following reunification. But there's been repeated criticism of the agency. The Rosenholz files are one example. These CD-ROMs contain information on West German Stasi collaborators and found their way into the hands of the CIA. Once they were returned to Germany, they were published, but only very haltingly, and some say this was a clear case of political intrigue. Even so, the agency is regarded worldwide as a model for the process of dealing with the legacy of dictatorships.
I should just begin by saying Marianne has just been correcting me and saying that it's much more than 20 kilometres of files. If you put them all together, it could be a figure much, much higher than that.
I'm afraid I have to correct you on a separate matter as well. We conduct very close investigation of the Stasi's West German activities, and it's been very difficult to process the Rosenholz files. We needed a lot of time for that, but it's not correct to suggest that we delayed publication for political reasons. That's nonsense.
OK, we'll take your point. Let's go back to these kilometres and kilometres of files compiled by the Stasi. A question that's often asked from people outside Germany is, was East Germany a nation of spies?
No, and I'm glad that you asked that question, because I can set the matter straight with this answer. East Germany's Secret Service was a very large operation, with 189,000 unofficial personnel and more than 90,000 officers at the end. But this figure represents around 2% of the population, people who worked full-time or on casual basis for the Stasi.
But let me interrupt you just for a second, because again, from outside Germany and inside Germany, but especially outside Germany, people then say, but that was actually many more people than in Nazi times. There was more spying, more spies than under the Nazis.
You can't really make a proper comparison, because it was a different system. The National Socialists had a huge network of informants and spies and denouncers, but at the Stasi there was a kind of contractual relationship between the spies. That's why it was difficult to estimate reliable figures in the case of the Nazis. There must have been many people who denounced their fellow citizens. We're able to issue figures in the case of the Stasi because there were employment contracts of a sort.
There's a certain continuity, nevertheless, between what the Gestapo did, what the Stasi did. Some people, again, outside Germany, will ask the question, is there something specifically German about spying on people?
An international comparison reveals that secret police services and dictatorships have much more in common with each other than we previously thought. We maintain contacts with Latin America, Iraq, Cambodia, and former communist countries. And although there are a great number of differences, essentially they're all very, very similar. It may well be so that because the Stasi was a German agency, it worked very intensively, very precisely and very bureaucratically. After all, it had a military-style organization through and through. But even these traits didn't make it unique. We're also familiar with other organizations, the KGB, for example, which worked in a similar way.
All this, of course, happened behind the Berlin Wall in East Germany. Give me a brief answer. When did you personally think the Berlin Wall is going to fall?
On November the 9th. I wouldn't have thought so previously.
Why do some people join the opposition and why do some people join the Stasi?
That's a very interesting question that I really can't answer.
But you said in your case it was your parents that made the difference.
Well, in my case, my private circumstances played a very important role. I found the right friends. Maybe I should tell a brief story at this point. My mother always told us how ashamed she was that she'd said nothing during the Nazi era, that she had remained silent. And perhaps by admitting this weakness to us, she made us a bit stronger. That could well have been a factor. And the other question, as to why people worked for the Stasi, that's what we're trying to investigate. It was out of conviction. Many thought they were working for a better world. Some hoped to gain advantages. Some were flattered because they felt a sense of importance. And they sought recognition. Some were blackmailed into it.
In that report that we've just seen, there were some remarkable people who were key opposition figures in East Germany. And one other question, I suppose, is why have very many of the opposition figures from that time have failed to, how should I put it, make their mark in today's Germany? Why is that?
I wouldn't agree with that. Firstly, you have to realize the opposition was quite small. One mustn't be misled by the images of large-scale demonstrations. Until the autumn of 1989, politically active opposition groups were small. They had support in the hundreds and not in the thousands in the GDR, and most of my political friends from that time are still active. In the voluntary sector, in associations, in local politics, but of course a relatively small number are visible on the national or state level. Many of those who are still very active, we don't see them on the news. But that doesn't mean that they are no longer political people.
We keep talking about East Germany and the East German opposition. What we're talking about, though, in essence, is civil courage. Is there enough civil courage in today's reunified Germany?
There can never be enough. I'm not satisfied either. Sometimes there's a lack of civility, of values, and sometimes of courage. And civil courage occurs when the two elements come together, the courage and also the values that are important to the individual.
Is it something you can learn, civil courage?
I think it is to some extent. For example, you can learn it from people you admire if you have ideals. But the foundation stone is certainly laid in the family. If you have the right friends, then it's easier than if you find yourself in bad company. And an important prerequisite is that you have been allowed to develop a sense of respect and of your own personal dignity. And those who have learned this about themselves are, I believe, in a position to interact in a respectful manner with other people and stand up for their dignity.
Wise words from Marianne Birthler. Marianne, the man in the red T-shirt at the beginning of that report, he described East Germany as gemütlich, as cozy. Was it?
It's interesting. People talked about work, about being cozy, that no one was starving. But there was one thing that no one mentioned, and that was freedom. I perceive this as very typical. If a society has lived for decades without freedom, then a fear of freedom becomes greater than the desire for it. You cease to know what it is and how important freedom is for us. And that's a problem that still concerns us today.
Interesting observation. What do you miss about East Germany?
I was 20 years younger, that's all. Otherwise, there's nothing I miss about this political system. And I'm very, very happy that I've been able to put it behind me.
Okay, the political system, but do you miss, people do say that there was more personal warmth. Is that true?
People said the same thing about the Nazi era after 1945. It's pure fiction.
Those are hard words. Hard words.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to change course. Just a quick question. Angela Merkel comes from the East, depends how you want to see it. She's made it to the top job in Germany. She's become Germany's Chancellor. How important is that in this great debate about where East Germany has come from, where East Germany is going to?
Well, she is sort of a laudable exception. I think it's important, also for the self-esteem of Eastern Germans, that they're also represented at the top level. And while it's the case that Eastern Germans have no influence in the economic sector, in the media, and in many other areas of public life, on a political level, it's a different matter now. And I think that's a good thing.
Okay. Thank you, Marianne. Now, let me just remind you that there's also a Talking Germany website where you'll find all the blogs I've written about my guests, including some off-screen impressions of none other than Marianne Birthler.
If you like Talking Germany, you can find out more on the internet. Our host Peter Craven is keeping a blog on the many shows and guests of the series. Find out more about what happens behind the scenes, gossip, experiences, and how the whole show is put together. Just visit blogs.dw-world.de/talkinggermany. And you can tell us what you think about the program there too.
Marianne is all ready for our quick quiz. Marianne, the Birthler Agency, a job or a mission?
Actually, it's both. It's a job, and I do quite normal things there, but it's also bound up with many aspirations and ambitions.
We're only going to have one more question. The Berlin Wall, is it history or is it something people have in their heads?
Unfortunately, the wall still exists in people's heads.
Marianne Birthler, thank you very much. If you've enjoyed Marianne's company as much as I have today, then do come back next week. Tschüss.